public incentives. Oh, got it. So one of the significant data products of our study is a TOD project inventory. So we evaluated 138 transit-oriented developments along the red and blue line corridors. Now this was based on a number of TOD features and some design characteristics. So the map on the right, you can see all of the inventoried TODs as red dots. So when we compared the locations of these projects and some development market metrics, we actually found that most transit-oriented developments were in station areas that already have strong development markets. So these are areas such as City Place Uptown, Mockingbird, and Cedar stations. So this inventory is not only an indicator of where TOD development market is strongest, but it's also a good performance measure of overall TOD quality and advancement along the corridors. So for example, the inventory reinforces the understanding that financial incentives have played a significant role in the development of TOD projects in areas of low market strength, right? So this is an example would be like Lancaster Urban Village. So this is the only transit-oriented development that you can see at the VA Medical Center station. This project did have significant investment from the city of Dallas. So it is reasonable to suppose that without public involvement, that project may not exist at that station. Next slide, please. So this slide does have a lot of statistics, and I'm not going to go through all of them for the sake of time, but I do want to talk to you about our big takeaway, which is the data is telling us there's a disconnect between who lives and works along the corridor and how these groups access and use different transportation modes. So the population has been growing along the corridor, yet we all know that ridership data has shown that it's also the ridership numbers have been dropping. Yet census data also shows that a majority of people living in this corridor are still driving to work instead of taking transit. So referring back to that TOD survey Travis mentioned, it found that 38% of residents specifically indicated that physical barriers were what prevented them from using dark transit. The survey also found that low-income households were most likely to use transit, yet demographic analysis tells us that that is not the largest group living along the corridor. So again, there's that disconnect between who lives and works in the corridor and how these groups are using different transportation modes. Next slide, please. So the first last mile study that Travis mentioned out of this 3 strategic studies did reveal the scale of our missing bicycle and pedestrian connections. So on the right is an example of the analysis done on downtown Garland Station. You can see that the sidewalk segments in red are the ones that were the highest priority. So again, this project did some estimates for the missing segments. It found that an additional $152 million in investment is still needed for the entire corridor to be safely connected between the stations and their surrounding area. So COG staff did do another sidewalk analysis, and it supported this finding. It showed that 67% of all parcels within a half-mile area of these study stations are inaccessible by sidewalk. So in summary, our findings from these station area contexts indicate that there is room for some additional policies to really advance our TOD goals along the corridors. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Travis to discuss how our policies and recommendations have been shaped from our findings. Travis?
Thank you, Catherine. So what we include in the document are some final recommendations for all entities who have an influence on transit-oriented development, public and private, to take away in advancing TOD in this corridor and beyond. The first is to increase the housing choice to better match current transit users. As you just heard Catherine say, there's that disconnect in many instances between the demographics of who's there and who's using transit. So do we increase affordable housing? And can we increase affordable housing, or can we get the folks who live there to better utilize the transit service? Second big recommendation, as was expressed by the first last mile study in our additional analysis of sidewalk coverage, is that we need to continue working on improving the pedestrian connections to station. And as many of you in the region know, that's an effort in progress. As we talked about, parking for TODs, we generally overpark a lot of developments, so we can improve in that area. Zoning, it's a key area to move forward on, rezoning properties that better fit the TOD design context. That includes the parking issue. And then really continuing on number 5 to use our economic development tools to advance TODs. As we mentioned, we feel from examples in the red and blue line corridor, they have been significant and will probably continue to be significant, especially in some station areas. And then finally, we looked at many of the station areas have neighborhood TOD plans, but there are some that could use new TOD plans or updates of old TOD plans. And that's really the way to get into the details of implementing these ideas at specific station areas. So that's some of the main takeaways from our report that we will be posting online by the end of the month. It's going through some final edits and proofing. But if you're really interested in discussing this in detail, I've provided my contact info and Catherine's contact info on there as well. And you should be seeing this online at nctcog.org/TOD very soon. So with that, I'll just pause and check the chat to see if we have any questions on this so far. But if not, I think we can continue moving on to our next local updates. And if you have a question, be thinking about it and put it in the chat. Again, this will be online and we're happy to talk offline about this further. All right, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and do an announcement of an upcoming initiative that we're looking to launch. We would really like to launch a regional parking database, very similar to what has been done in other regions throughout the country, really to better inform local parking policy with a more robust example of what supply is actually used at different types of developments or just different developments. And we think this is going to be an effort that would be really significant to reducing the cost of new developments like housing, which we know in our region isn't getting cheaper, and overall making communities more walkable. So this afternoon, while we're just getting started on this effort, we want to invite anyone who is interested to let us know if they'd like to join what we're calling our data advisory group that will really weigh in on how we collect and inform city policy with this data. So really making it useful to local governments. And we'll also need help as we go forward to gain access to properties who will allow us to study their parking utilization. So if you're a private commercial property owner who's listening, please consider joining us in this effort to allow us study parking on your property. But overall, for those of you in the public sector who understand the impact of parking policy, maybe from the economic side or from the zoning side, and you'd like to weigh on this process, we'd welcome you to kind of put your name in and recommend participation. And the commitment for this group we're imagining would be a minimal amount of reviewing a few short documents related to standards and then a few meetings to coordinate those. So let us know if you're interested. If you want to send us your information and say you're interested, we're going to put together a group and then send out invitations later in the next couple months. So again, that's myself and Catherine working on that effort, and our information will be available at nctcog.org/parking. So I will take a minute to pause and see if we have any questions in the chat related to our local updates before we get started. And a quick technical note, we had some technical issues and the recording did not start till Catherine was presenting on the TOD study findings. So I apologize on that, but the recording is in progress. So please be aware on that end of things. All right, so I do not see any questions on the chats. Don't see any raised hands. So I think we can move on to our main panel discussion today. Really excited to have speakers from cities of Fort Worth and Dallas, as well as our own Kate Zilke here at COG. So I'll now turn it over to Sean to get us started.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Sean Conrad with NCTCOG Sustainable Development Team. And we're going to delve now into our main topic for this meeting, which is equity in land use and transportation planning. Next slide, please, Travis. Before I introduce our speakers, I'm just going to give a brief plug for the NCTCOG gentrification report that we've completed a couple of years ago. This report is looking at the meaning and implications of gentrification for North Texas, particularly for infrastructure. It looks at the policy and legislative examples for programs that have been implemented around the country. And most importantly, it provides a resource guide that cities and agencies can use for strategies to best facilitate equitable outcomes for projects to either prevent gentrification or mitigate gentrification. So that report is available as a resource for you at the website that is shown here on the slide. All right, and now I am going to hand it over to Kate Zilke. She is also NCTCOG Principal Transportation Planner. She works in the area of environmental coordination and environmental justice, and she's going to talk about environmental justice and equity at NCTCOG.
Thank you, Sean. I'm happy to be able to present, so thank you very much. Can we go to the next slide, please? So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we here at the Council of Governments do related to equity and environmental justice, and then I've got a couple solicitations for you on some information we're seeking from folks. And then lastly, I'd like to pose the question of how can NCTCOG support the equity work that our member governments are participating in. So I'll start out with requirements for MPOs. I suspect that these are quite similar to the requirements that you all are already familiar with related to Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and to executive orders related to environmental justice and equity. So first, under Title VI, we do have to take action to prevent both intentional and unintentional discrimination based on these categories here that are identified in Title VI and other civil rights related statutes. From a transit perspective, we do submit our Title VI program every 3 years, and we do address any Title VI complaints or even just comments that we may receive. And we work with our transit subrecipients to support them as they comply with Title VI. And then as we shift into environmental justice, I'm sure you're familiar with these requirements to help protect the groups identified as environmental justice communities, including low-income individuals and people of color. And so we have to consider these groups' needs, address any disproportionately high and adverse effects. We have the public involvement component of full and fair participation and preventing the denial of reduction in or significant delay in receipt of benefits. And finally, we do have our disadvantaged business enterprise program, and we are happy to assist other cities as they develop their own programs and their own goals. Next slide, please. So one task that the Council of Governments staff has undertaken is to create this online demographic tool. It's our Environmental Justice Index, and it provides data from the American Community Survey, which of course anyone can download, but we've got this already processed that anybody can access here at this website, nctcog.org/EJ. So it's an online mapping tool where you can click on individual block groups and get the data, the demographic data that underlies all of those block groups. Also, through the Data and Links tab, you can download this. You can download the GIS layers. And then you'll see on the right that there were other tabs that can help you learn how to best use the data in the Environmental Justice Index. Next slide. We have a very similar tool called the Transit Accessibility Improvement Tool that identifies potential transit need. So you can see here, it works primarily with the 3 layers of low income, people with disabilities, and people aged 65 and over. But it does include additional transportation disadvantaged layers, plus Title VI layers to help our transit subrecipients comply with Title VI. But here we have a link. And again, you can download the data through the Data and Links tab. Next slide. We also do provide assistance to our partners. So in the past, we have provided ideas about how staff can train on Title VI. We've also provided some data via maps. For example, for a group who wanted to do some mobile air quality testing, and another who was interested in outreach to folks with limited English proficiency. Next slide. And then here, other tasks we undertake ourselves is with every update of our Metropolitan Transportation Plan, we conduct an equity analysis of the roadway and transit projects in the plan. We use our travel demand model to conduct this analysis. So an example is the image on the right, where we looked at how the plans in the project, how the projects in the plan affected job access by both auto and transit for protected versus non-protected groups. Another task we've undertaken is the one Sean just discussed, which was the gentrification toolbox. We have also worked with the community in Joppy, Dallas, who faced a lot of travel challenges, both from environmental sources and transportation sources. We have staff working in the Bachman Lake area to reach out to the community about transportation solutions for bike ped and roadway. We're working with the community near the Dallas Zoo and the 10th Street Historic District on a deck park project. And we have been coordinating as Paul Quinn College works on its project to use robots to deliver food in South Dallas. Also, prior to the pandemic, and hopefully quite soon again, we will be attending community events. And we have also been working on a food desert project. So this is one of my first solicitations. I've done a lot of outreach to nonprofit organizations, such as food pantry organizations, but I also need to reach out to contacts at cities and learn from them about the work that they are doing on food deserts. So my contact information is at the end. I would be thrilled to talk to folks about that. Next slide. So a big undertaking that our staff has been working on is an equity needs assessment. And so we were doing lots of GIS mapping and data analysis to see what needs equity communities in our region may face. So here's just a handful of metrics that we looked at that I thought were relevant to today's discussion. So tree canopy did tend to continue to be affected by historic redlining. Our freight team is as part of a larger project, did note that there are some inequities in some kinds of freight developments. There is the aforementioned food desert work, where certainly we saw a correlation between block groups that are both low income and people of color, or have high percentages of those groups, and food deserts. Although we did find that when aggregated to the regional scale, park access was pretty equitable. Next slide. And then I'm sure you're aware that in January, the president issued several new executive orders. I've listed here the two that I think are most relevant to this discussion. They're related to racial equity and to environmental justice and climate change. And while we frequently wait for federal agencies to issue guidance on how we should address these executive orders, we have found that in all of the large federal grant opportunities so far this year, there have been selection criteria related to these executive orders. So we are already needing to address them. Next slide. And let's actually skip this one and come back to this. I have a couple more really quick solicitations. We do have staff working on one of those big federal grant applications. This one is related to technology to manage congestion, and it is in the corridors in the map on the right there, I-35W up into Denton County, down into downtown Fort Worth, east on 820. It goes a little farther east, actually, than that map shows, into Irving, just south of the airport. So our staff is seeking projects that address environmental justice, equity, and barriers to opportunity using technology. And we would like to identify these projects and kind of marry them to our grant application. And the contact person for that is Tom Bamonte. Time is always of the essence with grant applications. So if you can reach out to him, that would be great. Next slide. My other hat is environmental coordination pre-NEPA. And we do have an online tool called the Regional Ecosystem Framework. We are hoping to update that to better suit the needs of our partners. So we are hoping folks can take the survey linked here before the end of the month. And so if we can backtrack again to that gray slide. Okay, so my final slide to kick off discussion. I don't know if it's now or at the end of the panel. What can NCTCOG do to help cities incorporate equity into their transportation and land use work? Because we are happy to support your efforts. And my contact information is at the bottom of the slide.
Thank you, Kate. Appreciate it. Yes, I think that would be an excellent question to bring up at the panel that we'll have about 3:25 or so. So thank you for posing that, Kate. We have a couple minutes left for some really quick questions. If anybody has a burning question they would like to ask now. Otherwise, as mentioned, we'll have a panel discussion later on where we will have plenty of time for questions. And I'm looking in the chat box. I don't see any chat messages or raised hands at the moment. So I think we will go ahead and move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Chelsea St. Louis from the city of Fort Worth. She is going to discuss equity and capital transportation planning at Fort Worth. And Chelsea is the Chief Transportation Planning Officer at the city. So take it on, Chelsea. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Sean. Again, my name is Chelsea St. Louis, and I'm a Chief Transportation Planning Officer in our Transportation and Public Works Department. Within the purview of my group, we handle Vision Zero, which our program is in development currently, street light maintenance, parking management, neighborhood traffic safety, as well as sidewalk implementation. And so in this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how equity is being integrated into our decision-making about delivery of city services. Next slide. So generally, transportation equity is really about the fairness with which transportation costs and benefits are distributed. And this is really important because transportation plays a critical role in how communities access the economy. And so we understand that historically, transportation and zoning decisions have limited opportunity for communities of color. And so that's why equity is very ever present in how we're planning and making decisions about infrastructure investments in Fort Worth. And just an example of how this the equity issue plays out, oftentimes we see how cities can disproportionately invest in roadways in already developing areas rather than putting investments in transit and other multimodal improvements in those areas of highest need. So through the work that we're doing today, that's what we're really trying to address in the city of Fort Worth. Next slide. So why is equity important to the city of Fort Worth right now? Well, in 2016, there was a police officer involved incident. There were lots of protests that followed and calls from the community for the city to really address racial equity in the city. And so in 2017, there was a task force that was developed called the Race and Culture Task Force. Their charge was to focus on evaluation of racial equity and bias in 7 focus areas, including criminal justice, economic development, education, health, housing, municipal governance, and transportation. From the work that they did within that task force, the city council, it culminated in the city council accepting recommendations from the task force in 2018. And really the mission of the task force and what we're advancing for now in our work is listening, learning, and building and bridging in order to create an inclusive Fort Worth for all residents. So that's really our focus right now. Next slide. The task force, I mentioned that the task force was focused on evaluating 7 focus areas. Through that work and the evaluation of disparities, it really was revealed that supermajority minority areas are the areas that are most disproportionately impacted by lack of infrastructure investment. And in Fort Worth, the SMMA group represents those Block groups where there's a population that's 75% or more minority. Next slide. And so in the task force, in their work and in relation to majority minority areas, they found that those areas were experienced the most poor condition streets, sidewalks, street lights. They had the most gaps in the sidewalk network. And these were also the areas that had greater transit dependence. So they have a larger amount of zero-car households. And as a result, they're also most impacted by pedestrian crashes, probably because of exposure, if you aren't in a vehicle, as well as all bike crashes, but more specifically the fatal bike crashes. And how do we correct this? Well, we take a hard look at what our funding mechanisms are and how we allocate funding to infrastructure. We all know as cities, we have limited funding sources. And so how we direct those funds, especially when we're thinking about who needs the infrastructure the most, both versus those who are asking for the infrastructure the most, that can have disparate impacts on communities of color. And that's something that we're trying to address in the city as well. Next slide. So after the task force developed their findings, they came up with many performance measures for us to use in advancing equity in our delivery of city services. These are just 2 of them. So two of the goals we're working towards are decreasing the share of poor condition and missing sidewalks in majority minority areas, and also decreasing the share of pedestrian and bike crashes. So that's what a lot of the work in my group focuses on. Next slide. In terms of what we're using to direct our work at a kind of at an operational level is our active transportation plan. So as I mentioned, the task force recommendations, they were adopted in 2018. In April of 2019, the city council adopted the active transportation plan for the city. And what made this plan different than a lot of other planning documents in the city is that it clearly communicated a commitment to the importance of equity and how we implement our projects in the city and prioritize investments. And so on this slide, you see the prioritization criteria that were used in the active transportation plan. So you see that we gave 40% weighting to sidewalks, 40% weighting to equity in relation to sidewalks, 30% related to bikeways, and 30% in relation to trails. And so the outcome of the active transportation plan is really this very large map throughout the city. It identifies, relating to sidewalks, all of the sidewalk gaps in the city. So we used a pavement condition inventory. That work happened back in 2016, and it included our streets as well as sidewalks, signs, street lights, et cetera. And we're actually about to do another inventory this year, which will help us determine where we are in terms of starting to fill those gaps and addressing some of the other measures that the task force set out for us. So this slide, I just wanted to show what our criteria was and how heavily equity is weighted. Next slide. And so now we're talking about what the cost of this is and why it's so important that we target our limited resources. Citywide, there are almost 4,000 miles of sidewalk gaps in the city. And a planning level cost estimate is $3.6 billion for that. We see that higher education is probably the smallest amount. Sidewalks near colleges or community colleges, things like that, that's 154 million, but still a sizable amount of money. So we really have to target our resources. Next slide. Again, just want to show the same thing. On this slide, specifically thinking about our high disability areas and those who are vulnerable in terms of mobility. The city is in discussions about updating our ADA transition plan, and that conversation always comes up in the discussion about sidewalks. So it's something that's always ever present in our minds as we're moving forward with equity, as well as addressing our pedestrian infrastructure needs. Next slide. So how do we make all of this happen? How do we go from the task force recommendations to having a plan that clearly communicates equity as our focus in terms of pedestrian infrastructure? At the department level, we've taken those task force recommendations and we use them as performance goals. And that's the way we're operationalizing equity in our work. So the way that we're prioritizing equity is that we are using that active transportation plan that I mentioned specifically for sidewalks, since that's what we're discussing today. And we are prioritizing implementation of projects that rank highly in our ATP based on the criteria that were outlined on those previous slides. And so as we select projects to implement based on the ATP prioritization, we're using our capital bond funds and our maintenance funds to advance those projects. In addition, for our yearly maintenance funds, we are inputting those identified projects into a work plan. And that's really keeping us on track. We get thousands of requests per year related to infrastructure. And so having the ability to refer to the active transportation plan and the prioritization of projects in it, being able to clearly communicate the scale of resources we have available to implement projects has really been a tool for us, as we've many times had to deny requests or communicate that, you know, a certain project isn't a priority right now due to its ranking in the ATP, which is the direction we have from council in terms of prioritizing projects for implementation. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we implement projects with our capital bond funds as well as our maintenance funds that we receive yearly. What we're doing differently in terms of our capital bond funds. So in 2018, we had an allocation of funding going towards sidewalks as well as neighborhood traffic safety. But the projects that were implemented as part of the 2018 bond buckets, they were really based on citizen or stakeholder requests, or whomever was reaching out or engaged or knew how to engage the city. You would most likely be able to, you would be more likely to get a project in the bond previously that way. The only exception to this was the Safe Routes to School projects that were implemented. There was an extensive evaluation done on those in collaboration with COG and Blue Zones. And so with our 2018 bond funds, over 90,000 linear feet of sidewalks is in the process of being implemented, and over half of those are in MMAs. Next slide. So what's a little bit different this time is now we have an active transportation plan. And so bond planning started in the fall of 2019. And right now, staff has been evaluating the constructability of the top 300 active transportation plan sidewalk projects. And that has formed the basis of our sidewalk program for the upcoming 2022 bond. So that's a big departure from 2018 in that we still have a request process where citizens can request sidewalk projects, but we've provided a clear process on how we evaluate those requests, how we refer to the ATP ranking for implementation, and whether realistically we can implement projects in our bond or using our maintenance funds. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble here. Okay. And in terms of our Vision Zero high entry network, we're going to be using that to guide our investments for the neighborhood traffic safety school projects specifically. Next slide. So in terms of how we implement projects with our maintenance funds, this has been interesting because we have gone through a bit of trial and error. So with the expansive need in terms of sidewalk gaps in the city, in our group, we've been focused on how we can get projects on the ground quickly. We don't want to have this 8 active transportation plan sit on a shelf and then have to wait 10, 15 years to actually get projects on the ground. Oh, I have one. Oh, thank you. And so our implementation has been focused on sidewalks that do not require design. We've been using our standard specifications to do that work, and it's worked out tremendously for us. We aren't sure what our new bids will be related to new sidewalk projects, but our estimates initially were that we'd be able to implement some sidewalk projects at a cost of about $200 a linear foot. And it's been cheaper for us now, so we've been able to get more work done. In fiscal year 20, we implemented over 14,000 linear feet of sidewalks. 73% of that was in the SMMAs. This fiscal year, we're using a contractor. Last year, we used a mixture of contractor and in-house crew. So this year, we'll probably get a little bit less installed due to the cost. But either way, we'll have over 6,000 linear feet installed for this fiscal year. 75% of that is in SMMAs, and 5,400 linear feet is specifically related to transit connections, specifically bus stops. So Trinity Metro provided us a prioritized list of their higher ridership routes and where they would like us to assist with implementation of sidewalk apps. Next slide. So that's kind of the ways that we're using equity in our active transportation plan, specifically to get sidewalk projects on the ground quickly. And our work plan has been invaluable in helping us to be proactive rather than reactive, which is it's absolutely imperative if you want to stay focused on equity in the way that you're delivering projects for your citizens. Our asset management system is still being built. As I mentioned previously, our active transportation plan and the inventory of sidewalk gaps was based on our 2016 inventory. We have a 2022 inventory that will be built soon. And so we'll have even better data to be able to track our progress moving forward. Equity is will continue to be a cornerstone of our fiscal year 2022 work plan. And I just listed out all of the areas within our larger group where we're considering equity. And I'm open to questions if anyone has any.
Thanks, Chelsea. Appreciate that. We have about 1 or 2 minutes. If we have any questions for Chelsea that you'd like to pose right now, and otherwise we'll definitely have time at the end of all of our presentations for a panel discussion.
Hey, this is Travis. One quick question. Chelsea, it sounded like overall past bond relied on more citizen petitions, and y'all are moving towards more recommending bond items based on your planning recommendations and y'all's global. Hopefully that will land in more of those majority minority communities. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes. Since the ATP rated equity, meaning those MMA areas, highly within the ATP, that we're implementing sidewalk projects that are, I would say, mostly in those areas, because those are the areas of the highest need in the city. So they rank highly in the ATP.
All right, thanks, Chelsea. I don't see any questions in the chat or any hands raised. So just a reminder, if you have any questions or comments, you can go ahead and enter those in the chat at any time and raise your hand at any time and we'll call on you. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So thanks again, Chelsea. That was really interesting. I appreciate it. The next speaker we have is Pam Thompson with the City of Dallas. She's Housing Strategy Manager in the Department of Housing and Neighborhood Revitalization. She's going to talk to us about the comprehensive housing policy. So take it away, Pam.
Hey, everybody, it's great to be here with you today. Next slide. So I'm gonna talk through the inequities in Dallas, talk about some of the comprehensive housing policy goals, talk through our current programs, talk about some upcoming initiatives, and then of course, leave some questions and answers. Next slide. So you saw the earlier slide for equity versus equality. This is another one. So we want to make sure that folks understand equity versus equality. Equality is where everyone gets the same thing regardless of their need. And then equity is where everyone has a chance at a similar outcome because they have resources that address their individual needs. Next slide. So the next few maps show some current inequities in Dallas. On the left, for example, the red shows areas in the city with incomes less than $50,000, and the blue shows incomes more than $100,000. On the right, we have the same pattern with much higher poverty rates in the southern sector and much lower poverty rates in the north. Next slide. Same here with a vast disparity in home ownership rates and home value. And then next slide. And again, with computer access and life expectancy. Next slide. So here you can see that the demographics match these patterns of disparity, with non-white households inhabiting the areas with lower income, lower home values, lower home ownership rates, higher poverty, lower computer access, and lower life expectancy. So the question arises, why is this? Where did some of this come from? So next slide. It turns out that this is partially the result of conscious efforts on the parts of the federal and local governments. Between 1935 and 1940, the Homeowners Loan Corporation graded areas of the city across the US from A, meaning green, and D to red. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation deemed these green areas low risk for mortgage lenders, and they deemed the red areas hazardous for lending. And the main criteria was the racial and ethnic identity of the residents. So it turns out that the choice to fund or not fund mortgages nearly 100 years ago, and then again through most of the last century, explains much of today's disparities. This map is available. I've got a little tiny link down there. It's a program called Mapping Inequality, and they've mapped a bunch of cities across the US. Any city where you kind of know the patterns of the demographics or the history, you can look at these old redlining maps and understand what redlining did to our cities. So next slide. So what are we working on to fix this? How do we turn this around? The federal government requires us to affirmatively further fair housing, and equity is one of the big 4 E's that we have at the city of Dallas. So we are consciously acting to undo the equities of the past. The inequities of the past. So the comprehensive housing policy was approved in 2017 with 3 goals: create and maintain available and affordable housing throughout Dallas, promote greater fair housing choices, overcome patterns of segregation and concentrations of poverty through incentives and requirements. These goals distill down to this: essentially more housing choices in more areas of the city. But the CHP is broader than just a policy. It's a compendium of our housing programs. Next slide. So we'll start with vacant and neglected land in the city. We have 2 separate programs that are focused on allowing tax foreclosed and surplus properties to be sold to developers to create housing. The map's a little hard to read, but it shows the pattern of properties that are eligible for the land bank. There's a whole cluster around the Fair Park area. There's some down in the bottom, south of the Trinity, and then several scattered throughout the Oak Cliff and north and south Oak Cliff area. So they're mostly in the non-gentrified areas of the city that were cut off from capital nearly 100 years ago. On the bottom, for example, you can see the image to the left is 2822 Pennsylvania Avenue, as it was a few years ago, a vacant lot, and then now it's got a tidy brick home on it and a family living in it. Next slide. One way to prevent homes from becoming tax foreclosed is to ensure that when the owner dies, the heirs of the owner can get a marketable title to the property. That is, in thousands of homes across the city. Daddy died years ago, Mama died recently, there's no will, and the 3 kids and various grandkids don't have the resources to go through probate to legally inherit the home. So the home instead slowly degrades. So to help with this, the city has a title and property assistance program that provides funding for legal services to help clarify the legal ownership of the real property in certain areas of Dallas. It strengthens neighborhoods by allowing these estate of houses to be sold and or renovated. And it includes community legal rights, information sessions, and services to prevent future cloudy titles. Next slide. The next program we have is our Home Improvement and Preservation Program with 3 sub-programs. One of them provides small amounts of money for minor home repairs. The major rehab program is for moderate and substantial rehabilitation, including new electrical service to the house, new air conditioning, new roofing, that sort of thing. And then the reconstruction program is by referral only from the rehab program, and it provides funding for demolition and complete reconstruction of homes that are beyond repair. Next slide. Another program is our new construction and substantial rehabilitation program, which we just call development. It's a standing notice of funding availability with repayable or forgivable loans at 0 to 3% interest. And both new single family and new and rehab of multifamily projects are eligible for this program. And the income and rent limits of the eventual tenants or owners depend on the regulations associated with the source of the funding. So on the left, you'll see Palladium Redbird. So on the parking lot of Redbird Mall is this new mixed income development that's going to be part of a mixed use development. And then on the bottom is the senior living facility that's called the Estates of Shiloh, and it's up in the Casa View area. Next slide. So additional incentives. In early 2021, the city released an RFP to develop mixed use and mixed income TOD projects on city-owned property near DART stations in Dallas. The sites are near several DART stations along the Blue Line in southern Dallas. And in May, council authorized initial agreements with 3 developers for sites near the MLK station, the Camp Wisdom station, and the VA Medical Center station. So we're really excited about that. It's always a good thing to convert parking lots or vacant lots to mixed income and mixed use projects right by the train stations. Next slide. Another new initiative is called One Dallas Options, and it's essentially our mixed income housing development bonus on steroids. So it's being broadened to include by right regulatory, administrative, and fiscal incentives for mixed income housing. The incentives include density, FAR, and height bonuses, the parking reduction, prioritized and expedited plan review and rezoning, and then financial incentives such as development fee reimbursements, property tax abatements, reduced infrastructure costs, grants to city-owned land, and then gap financing grants. Next slide. And lastly, we've begun an equity audit of the CHP. So the CHP is really focused on undoing the evils of the past, but it's a living document and it needs to be regularly updated to respond to the needs of the city. And so it was originally designed to focus efforts on building from strength, but we have some concerns that this can perpetuate inequity. And so we hired a consultant in June to review the CHP and to make recommendations so that we can balance investment with preserving affordability, protecting households from displacement. So that's about it. And the next slide is just for questions. If you have any, I'll take them.
Thank you, Pam. That was great information. We are a little bit ahead of schedule, actually, so we have a couple of minutes. If anybody has any questions for Pam, at this time, go ahead and drop those in the chat box or raise your hand. Or, as mentioned, we will have some time after our last presentation for a full panel discussion. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions right now, so we will look back at the end of our presentations and open it up for questions and discussion. We are going to then move on to Robin Bentley with the City of Dallas. She is the Director of the Office of Economic Development, and she's going to talk about the City of Dallas Economic Development Policy.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here. It's so interesting to hear how the different cities and groups are all sort of swimming in the same direction. So I'm here to talk about what the Office of Economic Development is doing, and we're probably the newest of these initiatives, so just getting started, but I'll give a little bit of background and take any questions at the end. Next slide, please. So as Pam walked through, everyone was aware of the racial and economic non-inclusivity of the city of Dallas, but when the Urban Institute released this report in 2018, ranking cities by their economic and racial inclusion, I think it was a little startling to everyone to see where Dallas ended up on the list, which is out of 274 cities. We were 270th on economic inclusion, 246th on racial inclusion, and when they combined those two indexes into an overall inclusion ranking, we were 272 out of 274. And I think that was just really startling for people, even when you know the underlying data, to see it broken out in that sort of ranking was not great to see. And so in response to that, next slide, the city has done a number of things to try to address that issue. And so the one I'm here to talk about today is one just adopted a few weeks ago down on the bottom, the Economic Development Policy. Although there have been a number of other actions, the housing policy definitely moves this direction. the Resilient Dallas strategy and the related equity indicators, the new Office of Welcoming Communities and Immigrant Affairs, and then others I didn't even list, like the Transportation and Mobility Plan and the Environmental Plan, all are sort of moving Dallas in the same direction, which is to look at our policies and practices through more of an equity lens. But just a few weeks ago, May 26th, Council approved a new economic development policy. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's a 10-year policy, and there are 4 sort of guiding principles of it. I really want to focus on the first one, which builds on what Pam was just saying. The city, through our own policies, created many of the disparities in the city, and it is our obligation now to proactively correct those. And so a lot of the work outlined in the policy document is doing just that, figuring out how we created issues and how we now can solve those issues. Next slide, please. So like I said, we're just at the starting line. Council just approved this a few weeks ago. We have engaged HR&A advisors, and their inclusive cities practice will be helping us walk through the policy work, teasing out how to prioritize all of this work over the next 10 years and turning sort of goals and ambitions into workable projects and products that we can bring to the council for approval. And so we're kicking off in August with HR&A. We'll be working with them for about a year to a year and a half. And then the staff will keep the work up for the next 10 years. Next slide, please. And so this is called the Economic Development Policy, but obviously racial and economic inclusion involves a number of policies. And so there is work in this policy for almost every department at City Hall, but specifically focusing on housing, permitting, zoning, land use planning, transportation, our procurement policies, and then sort of our infrastructure, how we structure our next bond program, like Chelsea was talking about, and how we build infrastructure in the city. Next slide. So the policy is, like I said, about 50 pages of very dense work. And so just called out a few things that are pertinent to the topics we're discussing today. In the permitting, zoning, and land use, there are a few bullets I wanted to talk through. One is the city's permitting process, which everyone reads about in the newspaper. I would say it's not so much inequitable as it's just inefficient. And so everyone suffers under that inefficient program policy. So we'll be working through with the consultants how to streamline that permitting process. We'll be looking at all of our zoning and land use policies in partnership with the Forward Dallas Land Use Comprehensive Plan. Because while I don't think that there are inherently discriminatory rules, there are definitely rules that have a disparate impact and are disadvantaging certain populations. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then Pam actually was just talking about this, the last bullet, developing affordable housing near transit. And so instead of filling the gap on all of these deals with just cash or incentives, one of the ways that we can fill the gap is through rethinking our parking requirements to help lower the project costs. Next slide. So the policy actually calls this will be one of the first things you'll see come out of the policy. It calls for creation of a new economic development entity. This would be outside of the city, probably a local government corporation. And the entity would have a twofold mission. First of all, they would do traditional business development, marketing, fam tours, branding, all that sort of thing. They would also lead the big real estate developments that are a little cumbersome to run through City Hall. So this will be projects like maybe Hensley Field, where the city's got a big real estate asset, needs to develop it at the speed of business. This entity might be where those deals go. Next slide. And so you may be asking yourself, does Dallas need an economic development entity? Aren't there a lot of chambers and other entities? And the answer is yes, but they're either very broadly focused, right, like the regional chamber, looking at all of North Texas, or they're very narrow, looking at a neighborhood or particular demographic. And it was kind of obvious but surprising to realize that there really is no one advocating just for the city of Dallas. And so that will be the area where this new entity focuses. And I think that's my last slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I'll take any questions as well. Thank you all.
Thank you, Robin. Really appreciate that. Yes, we have some minutes, a few minutes for sure to if there's any questions specifically for Robin. If not, we'll go ahead into our panel discussion and our wrap-up topics. So I am looking at the chat. Not seeing any chat messages or questions at the moment or raised hands. So why don't we go ahead into the panel discussion, and for sure you can ask questions there as well for any of our other speakers. I'm going to pass it on to Sydney Steelman, also with NCTCOG Sustainable Development Team. She'll lead our panel discussion and also discuss our funding opportunity and some wrap-up topics and discussion.
Hi, everyone. Like Sean said, I'm Sydney Steelman. I'm on the Sustainable Development Team here at NCTCOG. I will be facilitating the panel discussion, and then, like Sean said, move on into some announcements and close out our meeting. So to begin our panel discussion, I'd like to circle back to Kate's question regarding what can NCTCOG do to help our cities incorporate equity into transportation and land use tasks. Please feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you can and provide some feedback on that.
Well, I think I'll jump in. So I've been at the city of Fort Worth for about 2 years now. And one thing that I found to be a little challenging at first in figuring out how we were going to get our sidewalk program up and running, for example, is what would the contracting look like? What expertise we needed in-house to be able to do this work. We, in Transportation and Public Works, where we have different divisions. So we have a capital delivery division that focuses on bond implementation. My group is not in that group, and they typically do a lot of contracting with engineers for design and contractors for construction projects as well. But figuring out from someone with a planning background who has engineers, on our team, what expertise we need in-house to do sort of these near-term quick win projects. And also seeing what tools we have available within the city to get them done quickly. And so it's been a bit of, us trying to figure that out on our own. Also figuring out if it's something that's more cost effective for us to do in-house versus using a contractor to do. We ran into some issues in terms of staff capacity being diverted from other essential work to help with our sidewalk program. And once we got to that point where we recognized that, that's when we had to pivot and figure out what contracting we would do to still deliver on the work that we committed to. So if COG has ideas or best practices for how to implement certain types of projects in a shorter period of time, I think that would be helpful.
Thank you for that feedback. Kate, do you have any feedback for Chelsea regarding that?
So I think that's something that we would want to sit down and talk to the Sustainable Development Group about and see what that group's expertise is and how that could, we could collaborate to work to address these concerns of yours. We certainly want to make sure we're coming at that with a level of expertise, because that's certainly beyond my expertise, but we may have other folks that we can put our heads together and help you with that.
Great. Did anyone else have comments regarding that question? All right, if not, I'll move on to our second question, which is—
Well, actually, Sydney,
yeah.
we could also just try and solicit best practice ideas from the cities and put together some kind of best practices document for folks.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Okay. Good deal. Thanks, Kate. Thank you, Chelsea. So following up on our second question, I'll drop it into the chat, but our second question is, does your organization have methods for evaluating project impact in terms of equity? If so, please explain. So I will open up the floor for that one.
Well, I can start this one off. So I'll say right now, no. As we develop our Vision Zero program, we will. Also, we have a director of diversity and inclusion within our city. And so one of her tasks is to look at how all departments are delivering city services and how they're addressing equity in that. And so I believe part of that work will actually include be focused on outcomes and how we measure that over time. So I think we will have that at some point, probably within the next year.
Okay, great. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. Anyone else have anything to add? All right, I will then move on to our third question, which is, did your organization use any creative public involvement or outreach efforts to further equity during planning and implementation or planning projects?
Well, I'll just note that I wasn't at the city when the initial planning was done, so I can't really speak to the outreach that was in those. And then there's been COVID.
Yeah, right. That's all right. Thank you for your input anyways. I will open the floor up to any other questions or discussion if anyone has any. If not, we can move on to our announcements and closing.
Sydney, this is Travis. I think one question I want to ask all of our panelists to think about, speaking to other communities in North Texas, how might they start the conversations in seeing some of the housing policies, the economic development policies, and, from Chelsea's perspective, the transportation policies, in their communities? Do we need to wait for, like in the case of Fort Worth, something to happen to catalyze that, a task force to be formed? Or do you think it's possible for staff, since we were really focused on implementation of a lot of these, to sort of advance the conversation?
So I'll say from the City of Dallas perspective, that what we did was look around and see who wasn't at the table, who wasn't involved in the stakeholder discussions, who we had skipped over, and actively reached out to those folks and asked them to be involved with all of our housing policy, with creating new programs, with modifying the existing programs. We started a housing policy task force with a handful of people and a small steering committee, and we just openly recruited everybody that we could to be part of it. And now our housing policy task force is like 600 people. So advocates, people who live in housing, planners, developers, construction folks, community development folks, neighborhood leaders, as many different people, faith leaders, as many different people as possible, all being invited to weigh in on what we're doing, and being directly asked, how does it impact them, and what can we do to make that impact better?
I'll chime in. I think, no, there doesn't always have to be a catalyst. I think as cities are moving towards more performance-based planning and this focus on data, I think even for smaller cities, it can be pretty easy for you to just start there and see what the data tell you about outcomes. I remember when I did work for the city of Dallas and working on the resilience strategy, it was as simple as mapping out where transit dependent populations live and where is the actual transit service. And that's how you see the spatial mismatch. So it doesn't have to be, a big event that pushes you towards it. I think it just takes some diligence in looking at the data.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Chelsea. And I would add to that, getting a consultant helps because you're going to be bringing up awkward, uncomfortable points about your city, and that message comes across better from a third party than from staff. So sometimes a little distance in the messaging helps.
Great, thank you all for that feedback. I'll once again open up the floor to any additional questions or comments regarding that discussion. I'll give you all a second. All right, hearing nothing and seeing nothing in the chat. Travis, next slide, please. All right, moving on to our announcements in closing. We had a few announcements regarding some NCTCOG initiatives to share with you today before closing. The first one is something that Travis mentioned at the beginning of our meeting. It's regarding the Blue, Green, Gray funding program. There's a new funding initiative through this program, but before I get to that, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on the Blue, Green, Gray program. This program was established to promote the planning and construction of green or sustainable infrastructure. The primary goal is to advance small innovative projects that can be replicated regionally that also include aspects of water, environment, and transportation, which is the Blue, Green, Gray. Some example projects that you might see combining these elements include rain gardens, solar lighting, and recycled trail materials. Travis, next slide, please. So this slide shows all of our previously funded projects. We've had two calls, funding initiatives previously. Each of these projects has a full report located at this web link if you'd like to review them. I would encourage you to do so if you're interested in applying. Next slide, please. So we've recently launched a third round of Blue, Green, Gray funding, and this round will have a total of $300,000 available through RTC local funds through NCTCOG. There's a minimum of there's a $75,000 maximum to each applicant awarded. And we encourage anyone to apply that falls under a university, city, county, transit authority, private firms, nonprofits, school districts, and individuals. The applications are actually open now. We opened them on Monday, and they will be due at 5 p.m. in hand to NCTCOG staff on Friday, August 13th. You can find more information regarding the funding initiative, as well as application materials, like I said, the previously funded project information, as well as a more detailed timeline at the featured web link. And we will also follow up with more information to the task force after this meeting. Next slide, please. The next announcement I have is regarding the NCTCOG Green Transportation Infrastructure Workshop, which will be held on August 24th through Zoom, and the workshop will take place from 9:30 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. This workshop is going to focus on resources related to green infrastructure from both NCTCOG as well as EPA. And then we will also feature local examples of implemented green infrastructure projects from cities throughout the region. We actually sent out a save the date email earlier today that you all should have received. If you happen to not receive this, please send me a private message or feel free to email me and I'm happy to forward you that information. Next slide, please. Lastly, our team would like your input on future meeting topics and future meeting format. I will drop a poll link in the chat and one second, sorry. Okay, I have linked a meeting poll in the chat. If you could please visit that link and fill out our poll, we would greatly appreciate it. We have previous meeting topics included on this slide for your review if you're interested in seeing what those are about. And I believe Travis will share the poll results live.
Yeah, I'm working on getting those up, Sydney.
Okay.
While we are waiting for people to fill out that form, I just want to say thank you again to all our speakers who joined us this afternoon, to Robin, Pam, Chelsea, Kate. Really great presentations. I think you guys present a lot of tools that our folks in the region can learn from that advance the implementation of equity, because part of the goal of this task force is to talk about the tools. We can talk about the concepts of equity, but how do we make it happen in our communities? And I think you guys illustrated some great examples of that. So I really, really appreciate you guys taking time out of your day and time to put together these very informative presentations. And so, as you're filling out this poll, think about the topics you as a professional would be interested in hearing. How do we go from ideas to implementation or address these challenges in our region? So let's see, I think we've got our live poll going now. So yeah, again, question is, what themes or topics would you like to talk about? In our slide, we had mentioned, we talked about rethinking the right of way, such as how do we use our streets for parklets and other alternative modes related to equity. Oh, hold on, let me go back to that screen. We talked about parking management and reform. We've talked about infill development and zoning and various implementation examples of that, and equity and land use. So we want to continue addressing topics of need to the region. And then as things evolve here with the public health concerns and things reopen, we have the option of doing this in person, doing this virtually, and we're interested in your feedback on that as well. And Sydney, will this be live after the meeting ends for feedback, or is it now?
Yeah, it will be.
Okay, great. So feel free to share this with your colleagues out there as well. All right, well, looks like we've reached a point where we've got less movement, so interesting. Got a lot of interest in the site design and building form category, which is something we comment on related to transit-oriented development in our red and blue line study. So we definitely have some ideas on that particular topic. And it looks like there's an interest in continuing to do this virtually. I know we have attendees from across the region, and as you all know, it is a big region that might take a minute or two to drive across or travel across in any mode. So we can understand that need there. So Sydney, I'm going to go ahead and let this run in the background. Thank you everyone for accessing that and giving us your inputs. Go back to the PowerPoint. And again, feel free to share that link. I think, Sydney, we can probably put that into our material online email. Probably. But with that, we are at 3:30, so we can wrap up a little early. Unless there's a burning questions, comments, topics. If anyone wants to unmute and discuss ideas for future task force or still have a question lingering from today's presentation, we'd be happy to address that now.
We do have one additional question in the chat. Has anyone or any organization tried to perform a study or analysis but had major setbacks from a lack of accessible data? And if so, how did you get around that or resolve it? Any comments from anyone on our panel or from the audience?
So I think the question here is something like, do we have the right data to perform the analysis that helps us reach the conclusion we want? Or in this case, measure the equitable outcome we're looking for. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's kind of what I was looking for, just because when I was thinking about this question, I work at COG, for a sustainable development team, and the data source we have is very vast. I mean, sometimes there's limitations, but I'm also a student, and sometimes a student is very limited what kind of data you can have. And start thinking about like, well, if I was never an organization and I didn't have data and I don't know where to get the data or make the data, what can I do to resolve the issue?
Yeah, this is Robin at the city. I would say whenever we run into data roadblocks, that's what we call nice people like you or call our friends at Dallas College or the DRC, folks with maybe different data sets than we have access to, because between us all, we probably got it covered.
Thank you, Robin, for that shout out and that regional collaboration idea there. If one entity might have issue getting the data, others can assist. And one of the examples that comes to mind that really touches on what Chelsea spoke on, like the active transportation plan. We really don't know across the region how much sidewalk we're missing, and where in our lower income or disadvantaged communities we might not have sidewalk. And so it's actually been, the city of Fort Worth spent a good deal of resource to map those sidewalks. The city of Dallas recently did a sidewalk master plan, and COG, we employ staff to do a lot of manual digitization of sidewalks as well. So sometimes it does take some patience to get the data that we really need to inform our implementation.
I'll jump into that on the program evaluation side of things, particularly as we're taking a fresh look at equity as opposed to being race blind or race neutral. We found that we actually have to start creating that data ourselves, collecting it, making sure that we've got software that we can collect it in, and then analyzing it as it comes in. So it's been very hands-on and labor intensive to capture what we need to capture to see how we're doing.
Thanks for that feedback, Pam, and thank you for those responses. I think we're ready to close now, so appreciate everybody's input and all of our great presentations and discussion. And feel free, of course, to follow up with us if you have any remaining questions or topic ideas for items you'd like to see covered in future meetings. We'd really love to hear from you. Thanks, everyone.